but he read a lot and he studied a lot, and had like mentors like Derek and Nick Carroll and other people. And so he talks a little bit about cutting his teeth and getting his writing chops at the beginning and what that was like. And so this is a really interesting section, and like how he's trying to figure it all out and make that transition without becoming like a sales rep. Right, and not there's anything wrong with that either. It's just,
you have all this life experience. You've seen stuff from the inside. How do you then articulate it for the rest of us?
Exactly. So here we have Brisick talking about leaving the tour. So then you turned pro. I mean, you finished turning pro. You kind of, what was the transition like? I mean, it was 91, 92?
It was 1991. And it was really hard because I did 5 years on tour, and in the 5 years that I was on tour, I was a middling pro at best. I mean, I never really broke in. I had a couple of moments.
Would Derek Hine call you a journeyman?
He called me a journeyman, yeah. But again, no matter what, where I sat on the level, and it was funny because on tour I had this. I would sign autographs. I'd be at some beach halfway across the world. I'd exit the heat, and I'd be signing autographs, and then I'd go home. And when I was getting 24, 25, all my friends were graduating college and going off into their great careers. And it was this, it was like I'd go from thinking I was a superstar to going home, and then I'd be this sort of glorified backpacker guy who I don't quite know what he does for a living, but he's a surfer. So it would be this contrast. And when I stopped competing, it was hard to, I was full of this sort of hubris that I had to it took a while to shake that off and take off the blinders. But it was also this weird revelation because pro surfing makes you do this. You're just thinking, okay, I got to win that contest. I got to get these new boards. I've got to do this. I got to going on a photo trip, blah, blah, blah. And then as soon as I realized that's not what my life's about anymore, it was like this, and suddenly it was like an LSD trip or something where the world is so unbelievably fascinating, but I've been looking over it the whole time. I've been blind to it.
There was a trip you took to Western Australia with Tom Curran, actually, and you were covering that?
Yes, that was one of the first pieces.
This was kind of, for you, like a turning point, no?
Yeah, no, it was a really interesting turning point, and it was this sort of transition phase. I was living in Sydney at the time, and I just started to write for surf magazines.
But you were still kind of a professional surfer. You were still being paid for photos and everything too. So you were kind of on this verge of maybe deciding what you were going to be doing?
Yeah, it was a kind of transition phase, and I'd been on tour, as I said, for 5 years, and I was getting interested in writing. But it was, for me, and maybe this is just trying to convince myself of something. Once I stopped pro surfing, it was just I wanted to shed that off me. I mean, I did not want that to be. I realized that the thing that I defined myself through for so many years had just, declared bankruptcy. So now it's time to figure something else out. So I kind of overzealously wrapped myself around this idea of being a writer. And I read, Charles Bukowski and Kerouac and a lot of kind of writers that were very stylized or what have you. But it was this thing that I was trying to convince myself, okay, I'm going to be a writer and I'm going to be Jack Kerouac in 2 years. And that was the hubris from the surfing speaking, And so I did this trip to Western Australia with Tom Curran, and it was in 1992. And it was a really, really interesting one because, as I said, in my mind, I'm thinking about being a writer, but I was still a surfer, and I still got pictures in the magazines and stuff like that from that trip. But Tom, who had won 4 world titles by then? 3, sorry. Was strangely, he had always been the god, but I realize now when I look back, as he was probably going through something similar on a whole different level, of course, but he was transitioning out. He was figuring out at 26 years old or 27, where do I go with my life? He again, I don't want to speak for him, but that was the impression that I got. And he was recording his first ever album, a musical project with some musicians, and it was just interesting to watch him become sort of lost, go from being so. Go ahead.
I was just going to give you a little context, like for those you may not know, like Tom Curran is like kind of God to surfing. Every surfer who surfs today is a product of his style of surfing. I mean, he's probably one of the most influential surfers in history, possibly even more than Slater in some fundamental way. So for someone who's was making quite good money and everything, to be in a similar position must have been, I mean, scary, no? I mean, we've all, I think, been in a point where we're like, shit, what am I going to do?
Yeah. No, and but it's funny because it was almost much bigger than just our own little bubble. That the early '90s, there was a recession. The recession hit so hard in the surf community, and all the kind of day glow and all the bright, in-your-face, big logos of the latter half of the '80s suddenly turned really soulful again. I mean, boards went clear, guys wore black wetsuits, and when I look at it now, I almost feel like that was. We were all trying to sort of find out what surfing meant. We'd gone off on this branch of the competitive thing, a lot of kind of just crass kind of advertising, in your face, and with the economy and with sort of Seattle grunge music, a lot of things just took it into this kind of lo-fi direction, and a lot of the surfers were sort of trying to figure out where they fit in with all that.
And you were trying to figure that out as well.
Yeah.
What was the moment where you just thought, that's it, I'm done being a pro surfer?
It happened very abruptly in an office at Quicksilver in 1992, I think, 91 and 92. But I hadn't been performing, and I kind of got my walking papers. And it was.
Did you know it was coming when you went into the office?
Yeah, I kind of knew it was coming, but I was in denial. And it was funny because when I first started on tour, I was very much that very focused athlete and big ambitions and kind of very, very innocent. And then after 5 years on tour, I was partying a lot. I wasn't as rigorous and focused as I could have been. And there was a sense that I don't think I even knew it at the time, but I was just sort of sabotaging myself to face the inevitable.
So then you started doing photography, writing. You became the editor of Surfing Magazine, actually. Before we get onto the next photo, I want to talk how did that transition happen? What led to that? He led, Surfing Magazine, which is a huge publication. It's for someone who, I think it's quite an achievement, and Thanks. Something that it seems like you kind of you glance over sometimes.
Well, I always read when I was on tour. I always kept journals. A lot of the journals were almost more sort of competitive minded. It was, writing notes about the heats I'd surfed and what have you. But when I stepped off the tour, the idea of being a writer was so romantic to me. And I remember reading passages in books that were just so fascinating to me. And I think Paul Theroux wrote something about a writer is an education in the eyes of the public. And that, to me, especially coming out of the pro surf bubble, was such a romantic notion. The idea of, okay, you can be a writer and it's almost sort of licensed to meet a lot of interesting people and go to a lot of interesting places. And I had, I guess, what you might call a sort of backdoor entry into journalism in the surf community, mainly because I had a reputation in surfing. I mean, my writing chops had a long way to go. I didn't have a degree from a college, but I did know expertise, and I did have that sort of first-hand thing, which counts a lot in the surf community across the board.
And your father was a writer, too, which must have helped a little bit, no?
Yeah, no, and he was very supportive. And in a weird way, there was this sort of poetic justice, or whatever you want to call it. Everything came around. But so I got right in the mix, and I started working for surf magazines, and I went from being the guy that was, stepping out of the water and signing autographs and competing, to the guy that was actually running up and trying to get a quote from the next generation of guys for the article that I was writing for whatever magazine.
And you had a mentor that kind of took you in the name of Nick Carroll.
Yeah. I started working at Surfing Magazine, and Nick Carroll, who was the editor at the time, was incredibly helpful. And I think I got really lucky. I had a year or two where I went through a crisis big time, and then I started working hard, and then Nick Carroll at Surfing put me on a retainer as a writer, which was a weird thing because it almost was the same amount of money that I was making as a surfer, and the whole hand-to-mouth lifestyle was so, to this day, I'm used to that. It's it felt really, really comfortable. At one point, I was living in Sydney, and I worked for Waves magazine, and I had this small kind of monthly income, or monthly retainer that I was getting from the magazine, and I knew exactly what it was going to be, and that was more scary to me than not knowing, but having to cobble together, freelancing stories and whatnot.
And what was Nick like? I mean, as a mentor, I mean, he's Tom Carroll's brother.
Yes.
And he is someone that is really, prolific in writing, but he was also a pro surfer at some point as well.
Yep.
And he kind of took you in. You moved back to California.
I moved back from Sydney to California, and I started as a staff writer or writer at large for Surfing Magazine. And Nick was incredible mentor, editor, really, really passionate about surfing, really fit and always kind of just supercharged to go surfing and then to talk about books. And he passed me a lot of books, and he was an incredible mentor.
Nice. And now, here's the next section where we kind of follow the next evolution in Brisick, and it's his photography. And many people know him for his writing, but he's an incredible photographer as well. And here I was showing him in front of this audience. It was like a mix of his photos. One was of Kathy Connor, who is a.k.a. Gidget, who Gidget was based off of, and the Marshall brothers, who represent like modern Malibu. And so I wanted to kind of talk to Jamie about what it was like growing up at Malibu and surfing Malibu and that heritage there too from Kathy Connors.
So he actually grew up in Malibu?
Well, he's a Val. He's a Val.
Right, okay.
He's a Val. He grew up in the valley, but he grew up...
Commute.
Yeah,
he grew up over the mountains.
And he grew up surfing Malibu, and he's part of that whole Malibu DNA, I would say. And, what's funny is, like, I have this memory. My dad took us to California. It was a trip that I first surfed, like, first time I ever caught, like, a wave and, like, with a face. It was like a reform and dropped in. But we went to Malibu one day, and I took my brother's Aiken out, which is like this molded plastic board from like the 80s, and I'm surfing Malibu.
Was it already kookular? Did you bring it with
we
you?
brought it, yeah. I mean, it was like, but that was my brother's board.
Right.
I just took that out because he had just gotten a Corky Cool Stick.
Cool.
Carroll. Some of us called it the Corky Fool Stick, but so I was surfing there, and there's this guy ripping regular foot who looked just like my brother. And it was Jamie Brisick. Wow. And I must have been like 10 years old.
And you remind listeners, you and your brother are like
4 years apart.
Close.
4 years apart. And I was about like, 10, 11 years old.
Yeah.
Brisick was probably older, but my brother looked a lot older. And I swear, like they had the same kind of hair, both tall, skinny, had blonde hair, and I thought it was my brother for a second. I'm like, oh my God. And I almost said Jamie. And he probably would have responded because his name is Jamie too.
Oh, funny.
And my brother's name is Jamie. So it's funny. So it's this funny little story. Like I've told Brisick now in private, but it's pretty funny. Like, I'm like, wow, that's pretty wild all these years later.
It was Brisick.
It was. It totally. It had to have been. And it's just funny, like all these years later, how that shit works out. And here I am interviewing him. And I'm interviewing him about Malibu here, and basically like that lineage and life and growing up surfing there. So here's a section with like Brisick talking about Malibu. So here we have a picture. This is Kathy Connor, Gidget, the Marshall brothers who now basically rule Malibu. This is a nice this is your photos, your photography here, and I think it kind of captures like the whole Malibu scene. Mm-hmm. I mean, what was it like? I mean, Kathy Connor, was she aware? Is she aware of the impact that she's had on the surf community as Gidget?
I think she is, but I don't. It's not something. She's a really, really sweet, fantastic woman. I don't know. She was at the heart of it, but then her father had written the novel about her, and then by the time it got to the screen, it was Sally Field or whatever actress playing her. So in a lot of ways, she could kind of exist anonymously, but you would have to sort of know the backstory to understand